done. So what to say?
Okay. Good morning, everybody. After this very insightful talk by Alok, I have a tough act to follow. I'll be broadly giving you a few examples of some clinical issues, superficial clinical issues, and some scientific consideration. And I will be also moving on from a little bit into genetic diseases and also rare diseases, because many of the issues which are true for the relatively more common genetic diseases also equally true for rare diseases and vice versa. So, you see, India is facing a demographic switch, and because of the high birth rate, there are very few, large number of infants with genetic disorders are born every year. And these are the common genetic disorders, these are not the rare disorders. I could only get Dr. I.C. Verma's report of 2002, but I am sure after that they are there. So you can see that he expected the incidence, I think we can factor in 1.5 fold after this, about 5 lakhs of congenital malformations, G6PD, Downs, amino acid disorders actually is a very heterogeneous group. I mean, there are about a few hundreds, if not thousands of mutations in these amino acid disorders, beta thalassemia, sickle cell, and so on. And essentially, there is a clinical approach to genetic disorder management, which I will not go into detail, but what I really feel, the most important thing is to be aware that it exists, and that is what Alok has been emphasizing, that awareness amongst clinicians is a major issue when it comes to managing people with rare disease. And you can obviously work through the family and also look for it in the population and so on and so forth. And there are a few, once you've got your mutation right, or you have a certain kind of DNA diagnosis, there are a number of global databases in public domain which will help the clinician. The problem is simple, even I don't know how to use them, and most clinicians don't know how to use them in detail, except there are a few good specialized diagnostic centers, I must say, but most, by far, people are not even aware and how you could use them. One of them, of course, is OMIP, and there are many others. And finally, want to sensitize people to the concept of community genetics, to use genetics in the community to enhance the well-being in human populations and communities, and then of course leading finally to the benefit of the individual. So family history, ethnicity is very important, ethnicity becomes very important, background, age, and what Anurag said earlier in the morning, I want to remind you that India is prone to a number of caste groups which intermarry. So you have 1 million people of one caste group who actually, even if they are not closely related, will suffer from homozygosity related disorders similar to consanguineous families. This is something which we all must be aware of, and we must know that is why there is likely to be a larger burden of genetic disorders when it comes to detailed history. And in the lab diagnosis, I am sure all of you are now sufficiently sensitized to the need of a lab diagnosis, because a lab diagnosis is really essential for a specific diagnosis of a genetic disorder. But then there is other issues which come in with genetic diagnosis. Important is, especially in cases, not so much so in some of the cases which Alok referred to, is the issue of counseling. What to tell, how much to tell. I mean, does it, I think with knowledge is in a way gives you some power. So I feel one should tell a little bit more, even if today it's simple. Will you tell somebody that he is likely to get neurodegeneration at the age of 50? I personally feel that considering the advances in science, it is better that they know and they prevent and be aware of it rather than a more restrictive approach. But then there are professionals who perhaps deal with such issues better. So then there is the definition of rare disease. This is the WHO definition, that often a debilitating lifelong condition with a prevalence of 1 per less per thousand, and therefore the need for sensitization. They will not come to you in your garden variety of clinic. So, and the definitions of rare diseases vary from country to country, but then this is per 10,000 numbers. And there are, as Alok says, 6,000 to 8,000 diseases, and new diseases are coming up. But then it's interesting that of these so-called rare diseases, 80% of all rare disease patients are affected by approximately 350 rare diseases. So you can actually, one is individualized, but one is also, if you want to give a public health justification, there is a case to be made out for many of these diseases. For example, global prevalence cystic fibrosis, 1 in 30,000 in Asian Americans, Duchenne's, 1 in 10,000 male birds. I mean, quite a number. Gaucher's, this is 1 in 100,000. Hemophilia A and B, somewhere in 10 to 30,000. So, if you just compute the population, it gives you a reasonable number. Now, in India, there is a national policy which has been withdrawn, but I am quoting from that policy itself, because hopefully the new one will be better or not too different, I hope. But we have no such standard definition, and the data is there. And about 450 of such rare diseases have been recorded, and 50% are in children. And then there is this national policy again. So they divide it into categories when it comes to funding. 3 kinds of, where prioritize funding in a group where there is a one-time treatment available. Today with gene therapy, we hope it will be, the figures they gave ranges from 55 to 20 lakhs, which sometimes might still come in as less, good treatment outcome and so on. The next would require long-term therapy, and here comes the really prohibitive lifelong costs like Gaucher's disease and many of the diseases Alok mentioned. And then there are diseases for which, of course, supportive therapy is the only available option, and there are many of them. So I'll just give you one example. I'll just run through this. All of us have heard of phenylketonuria, and so I will not, but it's an inborn error of metabolism, and one can imagine that if there is a defect in enzyme C, you can have accumulation of the substrate, you can have the conversion of the substrate into undesirable products, and you can have a decreased synthesis of the product. And all 3 of these can actually be pathological. And clinical assessment and lab assessment, and here is the importance that I also want to emphasize, the importance of screening a newborn for genetic diseases, including, let us say, thalassemias and not only hemoglobinopathies and many other diseases, but also urine screening for PKU and many of these other diseases which are there elsewhere. Maybe we could start thinking in this, because the issue is simple. The issue is that there is a very early point when you can detect many of these things in the urine, and there some of these diseases, especially a disease like phenylketonuria and so on, which we have all, many of us have read, are very manageable until wait for the time when symptoms develop and you are running around and trying to diagnose, and then finding that actually the outcome is much poorer. So we can have screening tests and diagnostic tests for these diseases, and you can actually, inborn errors can be screened. Either you can even today do pre-implantation genetic diagnosis if you suspect from carriers. You can do prenatal screening and you can do newborn screening using MSMS. So this is something that we may think of in terms of bringing out. This is just to show a typical tandem mass with the phenylalanine being high in PKU, which is in the normal it is pretty low. And similarly, today with automatic systems, many of these interventions are actually within the realm of possibility, and they are not very expensive. If we take away include only the variable cost of each test, the variable cost per test is actually pretty low. Forget the price which is being charged, but when you actually want to do it, I don't think it should cost very much. So, and then you can have treatment approaches which you can institute, you can reduce the substrate, you can do enzyme replacement, which is expensive, and you can supplement the deficient products, and of course there is gene therapy, and we'll talk a little bit about this. Substrate reduction, typically in phenylalanine, you must restrict, and in many of these other disorders, enzyme replacement therapy, of course, you can replace, and Alok told you the very, very prohibitive cost of enzyme replacement therapy, highly prohibitive. And frankly, in today's day and age, if you again forget the fact that we are guided by the price the company sets up, I mean, many of this prohibitive cost is actually not required. And how do we tackle it in a world which functions on a market economy? I don't know. But this is true, that the price of goods has often very little to do with the manufacturing cost, because there is not much IP involved in them. Also, everyone knew that this enzyme was deficient. So these are these, US FDA has approved a number of enzymes from Fabry, Gaucher's and so on, SCID also, pegylated adenosine deaminase. Now I will come to it, please remember this, but this is required also lifelong. But this is the cost of enzyme replacement therapy, Alok and I have roughly come to the same numbers from possibly the same data, 39 lakhs to 1.7 crores annually. So you may think of how realistic or reasonable it is and how many of us can ever be able to afford it. We can supplement the product, that is not really expensive, but it is difficult, and many times it requires for life, for phenylketonuria, you do a load management, but then also family issues are involved. For example, carrier mothers should also avoid a high phenylalanine diet, because even they have a slight level, higher levels, because high PKU, high phenylalanine is more teratogenic. So essentially you have to treat the patient along with the family, along and sometimes go into the community. One of the things which was brought up was orphan drugs, and orphan drugs is something which is like a straw which a person having rare disease perhaps would like to clutch at, but essentially the claim of the law says that it started with the Orphan Drug Act 83, but then there are tax incentives and enhanced patient protectors and clinical research subsidies and use of the, encouraging government research enterprises to engage in research and development. But the problem is, I feel that personally they have been developed, but they have resulted in what is perhaps, I feel, are high-priced monopolies. So this is something that, sometimes I feel these need to be broken. So science, there is this discovery of the year finalist. This is an orphan drug for a disease, cystic fibrosis, not that rare but not that common either. And this comes in this is this year's discovery of the year family. Comes in 30 years after the gene that encodes the key protein was identified. And it is a 3-drug combination which is FDA approved. And you will find that many of these rare diseases, there is one mutation, a single mutation or a clutch of mutations. Same mutation all over. And in USA at least it takes care of 90% of the cystic fibrosis combination. And what these drugs, this is not gene therapy, but this needs to be taken lifelong. These are molecules which are to be given to children more than 2 years of age. And what they would do is they would stabilize they would deliver the protein to the surface and stabilize it. And so in a way I feel they act like molecular chaperones of sorts, and they would then turn cystic fibrosis from a progressively damaging lung disease to a manageable chronic illness for most. Now the point is, I hope many people suffering from it will actually be able to afford how to manage it. So one short answer, perhaps science today we are all hopeful, is gene therapy, and which is the introduction of nucleic acids into cells for purposes of altering the medical condition of the disease. Now in gene therapy, again Alok has referred to it, comes the use of oligonucleotides for the modulation of gene expression. So oligonucleotides is modulation. We are not really introducing a live recombinant organism or a structure into the cell, and therefore I feel the laws regarding this have to be kept much simpler. And antisense oligos have been on trial for cancers, etc. for a long time now. So they use transcriptional gene silencing, exon skipping, and we do anticipate regular burdens. And FDA approved siRNA therapy is around, Alok has given the list, and he mentioned about eteplirsen, which essentially binds to a mutated portion of the dystrophin mRNA and prevents the splicing and causes that exon to be included and not to be spliced but incorporated into the final product. So essentially what you get, it binds to exon 51, skips it from the splicing machinery, and even though some amino acids are missing, there is a reasonably functional protein form. So what happens is that there is Duchenne's and there is this less severe Becker muscular dystrophy. So it converts the phenotype from the more severe Duchenne's to the less severe Becker type, where the protein is still truncated but not so non-functional. So the person, some of the people with Becker's can actually be walking around till their 50s. So this is the essence of what it does. My thing is that an oligo is something that is made everywhere. I mean, this is the kind, I feel there is no reason for this oligo. Forget the IP and everything. Exon skipping was known for a long time. It is the product of public funded research. The concept is there. Somebody has done a trial. Do they really have a right to charge so much? That is an issue which goes beyond perhaps this input. And this is this picture I got from this thing. Anurag referred to this thing. Again an exon skipping nucleotide. It is a drug developed for a single patient, and this is an antisense nucleotide developed. It's called Milacin because it's been developed for Mila, and it is really ultra personalized medicine. And again, same thing, it's an exon skipping. So I think there is a lot of research being into it. So this is one extreme. But again, I would like you to remember that none of these diseases are actually so rare. So there are many siRNAs under clinical trials, but then we come to the actual kind of gene therapy, germline versus somatic, and you have an in vivo gene therapy where the person is injected with the gene, ex vivo cells are taken from the patient and transferred back, and so you select the gene of interest, insert it into vectors and so on. So I would like you to concentrate on the first case of gene therapy. There is this girl whose, I don't know, pictures are there all over, so regardless of ethics and all that, I mean, it's there in public domain. And she was treated by French Anderson for skin in 1980. Now the bacterium with the cloned human ADA was incorporated, T cells were isolated, and the genetically implanted cells were given back. Now 29 years later, what is the status of the 20 babies which were treated with the gene therapy? Constant. It was stopped because of side effects. But let us see, 18 of them are still alive. 17 of them do not require any additional therapy. You don't have to give them pegylated ADA at frequent intervals. 5 of them developed leukemia, 4 were cured, 1 died. So one is that this obviously catapulted us into being much more careful with gene therapy. But if you look at the final results today, I mean, how many people with ADA actually will survive 30 years? And then you see that even with this so-called faulty gene therapy, the outcome was better than the natural history of the disease in today's best case. So this has been mentioned for spinal muscular dystrophy, another approved gene therapy. And of course, we are now in the era of CRISPR-Cas9 mediated genome editing. And very recently, for sickle cell, there is a CRISPR therapy which is in trials, and the results are not final, but they have shown improvement in both patients having thalassemia and with sickle cell. These are one patient each. And what they do is very simple. Here it's a common phenomenon that when we don't have oxygen because of sickling, hemoglobin F, which is our fetal hemoglobin, that expression is increased. Now once a child is born, hemoglobin F is shut off because it's not required. Then the hemoglobin A, which is our natural adult hemoglobin, comes into play, and this is repressed by a repressor. What CRISPR does in this case is to make the repressor non-functional by introducing a mutation so that hemoglobin A comes up, and so the person has an alternative source of oxygen. And this is hopefully because they take out the cells, kill off the old bone marrow, reintroduce, and it's just like a BMT, not with someone else's cells but with your own cells with modification, and then the person can hopefully live lifelong. And this is the story, and hopefully this will work. And I can see the clock as well. So scientists have been using gene-edited stem cell also to treat HIV with mixed success. And then these are the iPSCs which can be used, but then which brings us back to the dilemma of CRISPR gene therapy and embryonic gene therapy, which I will not really go into. But the point is that even the first gene therapy in the embryo was scientifically flawed. They corrected the CCR5 mutation to protect against future infection by HIV. The fact is CCR5 is required by the immune system. People who have CCR5 mutations have a lower lifespan than people who don't. So, before we embark into this, apart from those ethical issues and who took money from what and why they did what and all that, this is important to be scientific. There is another one where I feel that, implantation corrections, this is again done by a fly-by-night Russian operator, might not be that once the technology is sorted out. This is a family with congenital deafness, and they have a fixed connexin mutation. So if they are able to correct that in utero, that has to be taken up. The point is, will our society be able to say, this clinic will do this mutation and only this one and not that one? And those are issues which go far beyond our time. So what next? There is a massive increase in scientific and technological capability. There are many gene therapy trials, immense possibilities, but so near and yet so far. And these, I think, are perhaps more than science. I think we have the scientific capability to handle quite a few of the rare diseases with a reasonable cost. So thank you very much, and thank Dr. Alok Bhattacharya and the organizers for having me over for this talk. Thank you.